How is this possible? When on a trip through the mountains, John stumbles across a steel structure mostly buried under the snow. What could this be? He knew that he had to get in there, but could have never expected what he was going to discover inside. There was a very good reason for this structure being here, but it was a reason that John quickly realized he was not supposed to know. John had been exploring mountains for many, many years by now, but he had never seen anything like this before. What was something so high-tech looking doing in such a remote and difficult-to-reach place? So many questions, but he had no time to think about answers now. Getting into the structure, John was on the verge of hypothermia and had to get into whatever this was quickly to find some cover from the cold winds. It was not easy, but he eventually managed to force himself into the strange steel structure. But when finally in, John almost immediately forgot about how cold he was as he was completely taken aback by what he found inside. But what was this giant steel structure doing hidden away high in the mountains? How had it gotten here, and what had John just discovered inside? But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. John wasn't easily rattled. After years of hiking and climbing some of the most challenging mountains in the world, he figured that he'd seen it all. There was rarely a time when he felt uncomfortable or on the verge of panic, but his next trip was about to change everything. After reaching the summit of Mount Everest, John was more interested in lesser-known locations. He disliked how busy it was around the famous mountains, and he didn't want to compete for resources like translators. He started looking for something in a more remote area. That decision would put him on a crash course to an impossible discovery. John knew that he was a skilled climber, but he tried to stay humble as he sorted through his options. Many of them were just too easy. He wanted to go somewhere truly special, a place so unique that it would be a true challenge. John would most certainly get his wish. John settled on Annapurna Massif, a mountain notorious for its fatalities. There were only a handful of routes that could lead to the top, and all of them were both dangerous and grueling. Several of John's friends had completed a climb there before, but John had no interest in following in their footsteps. John studied the mountain obsessively for weeks. He wanted to know every angle and crevice he could. The weather conditions were unpredictable at best, so he focused on what he could learn for sure. Slowly, he started designing a new route up the mountain. It seemed that no one had ever taken that path before, and with good reason. The route that John proposed involved climbing a smaller mountain first and then hiking across a snowy depression that connected to Annapurna Massif. It wasn't a long journey, but it was definitely taking a risk. When he finally had his plan together, John told some of his friends about his idea. Their response shocked him. John had expected his friends to approve of his creativity. Instead, they immediately tried to talk him out of it. Even Laura, one of the best climbers in the world, refused to back him up. She swore that he would fall into some crevasse and never be seen again. But John didn't heed their warnings. John spent the next month preparing for his trip. Laura helped him find some specialty safety gear, though she still insisted that he was being foolish. John didn't agree. He was in the best shape of his life and had made one of the fastest climbs of Mount Everest in recent memory. But when it was time to go, he wondered if maybe he was making a terrible mistake. Several of John's friends had sustained serious injuries in falls and accidents over the years. He knew that if he got hurt on the climb, there wouldn't be enough time to rescue him before he froze. But once he was on the plane to his destination, he finally relaxed. John had no idea that the mountain would be the least of his worries. The first stop on John's journey was a small mountain village that many climbers used as a sort of base camp. Few climbers attempted a full summit to the top, so the locals were especially curious to know about his intentions. John tried to be friendly, but in truth, he wished that they would stop asking questions. After all, he had a secret to keep. John knew better than to advertise where he was going because he knew that the others would probably try to talk him out of it. He'd had enough of arguing with his friends, but when one of the friendlier locals took an active interest in his journey, John relented. He never considered whether the guide was a little too interested in where he planned to go. The local guide was adamant that John needed to take a different route. He talked about all the climbers who died, even on easier paths to the top. The man was incredibly knowledgeable about the area and seemed to be able to recall even distant events in great detail. John was impressed, but he sensed that the guide wasn't telling him everything. To get the guide to stop bothering him about it, John lied and promised the guide that he would try a different path. He even had the man mark it on his map and explain the various parts of the route to the top of Annapurna Massif. but it was all a show. John woke up early the next morning while everyone else was still asleep. He gathered his gear as quietly as possible and headed off up the mountain. At first, he followed the route the guide had shown him. It was admittedly better than the one he'd planned on taking, but when he reached a fork along the way, it was time to make a decision. John couldn't give up on his original plan. It wasn't an easy climb, but as the hours went on, he realized that he was happy with his choice. He made great progress on the first mountain and even stopped to camp early sometimes. But soon, he was approaching the crossover point. John looked out at the short stretch and wondered why people were so worried. The mist made it almost impossible to see, but John crossed the area quickly. He was almost to the other mountain, where he knew he'd need to make it up a steep slope to reach the main route. But when he arrived, he realized that the two mountains didn't connect where he'd thought. It was just snow and ice. John looked back the way he had come, but he needed to slide down part of the first mountain to reach the flatter part. It would take too long to climb back up in such frigid temperatures. For the first time, John started to get scared. He needed shelter somewhere on Annapurna Massif or the plain itself, but there was nothing out there. Or so John thought. John had mapped several emergency routes in case he was injured or had to turn back. He chose the fastest one and moved as quickly as he could. Suddenly, he spotted something dark in the distance. Had he gotten turned around somehow? But it wasn't rock. In fact, it almost looked round. John had no idea what he's seeing as he approached through the mist. He thought that maybe he was hallucinating, but he wasn't even that high in elevation compared to other mountains he'd climbed. But John also knew that perfectly round edges just didn't happen in nature. If it wasn't some fallen rock from one of the mountains, then what was it? At last, John was able to get close enough to the strange object to touch it. It was larger than it had originally looked, and it towered over him. The outside was covered in hatches and flaps. John laughed when he pictured a UFO sticking out of the snow, but after a moment, his laughter trailed away. John looked at how much was covered of the UFO was covered in snow and ice. It couldn't have been in the mountains long, even though it was shielded from the worst of the wind. John knew that he should have left it and kept hunting for shelter, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. What was it, and how had it ended up in the middle of nowhere? John ran his fingers across the surface of the steel structure. It was colder than the wind whipping around him and perfectly smooth, almost too perfect. The snow crunched under his boots as he circled around it, looking for a way inside. And then he found it. A narrow seam running vertically like a door, barely noticeable beneath a layer of frost. With numb fingers and aching muscles, John pried at the edge. To his surprise, the seam gave way with a hiss almost, as if the structure was pressurized. The heavy door creaked open, and a wave of warm air hit him. Warm air? John blinked as the light from inside spilled out into the snowy white. It wasn't blinding. It was soft, artificial, a sterile kind of glow. But it was enough to make his heart race. The world outside seemed to vanish as he stepped in, the door sliding shut behind him silently. He was inside. What he saw next made his breath catch in his throat. The interior was far larger than it had looked from the outside. It reminded him of a high-tech laboratory, like something out of a sci-fi movie. Sleek metallic walls lined with control panels, screens that flickered to life as he walked by, and symbols, strange, unfamiliar symbols, glowed faintly in hues of blue and green. John wasn't sure where to look first. He cautiously stepped forward, drawn toward a central console that lit up as he approached. Without touching anything, the screen began displaying maps. Not ordinary maps. These were topographic scans of mountain ranges, including Annapurna, also places John didn't recognize. Some of the scans showed the interior of the Earth. Others displayed the solar system. One image showed a human skeleton, but not quite human. The proportions were off. Elongated skull, different rib structure. He backed away. This was no shelter. It was something else, something not meant to be found. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber. Not loud, not threatening, but calm. Mechanical. Biometric scan complete. Subject: unauthorized. Initiating Protocol 7. John froze. What? Who's there? No answer. The lights dimmed slightly, and one of the side doors slid open. He didn't want to go through it, but what choice did he have? He stepped through. The next room was darker, but filled with towering cylindrical tanks. Inside them, preserved specimens suspended in a thick, greenish fluid. Some looked like animals, others like hybrids. One had the body of a large feline, but with human hands. Another had wings, folded tightly against a humanoid torso. John's stomach turned. What was this place? Then he saw it, a table in the center of the room with a journal laid open. Actual paper. His gloved fingers flipped through the pages, revealing handwritten notes, detailed observations, theories, sketches. The date on the first page? 1963. It was an American journal. The signature at the bottom, Dr. Marcus C. Fielder. John's eyes widened. He remembered that name. A scientist who disappeared during a Cold War expedition in Nepal. Rumors had swirled about government cover-ups, secret missions, alien contact. So it was all true. John barely had time to process it when the voice returned. Protocol 7 complete. Preparing for cryogenic containment. Containment? No, wait, John shouted. But before he could move, the room began to fill with a white vapor. He ran back toward the entrance, but the door had sealed shut. The vapor numbed his limbs. His vision blurred. The last thing he saw was the screen flashing. Subject secured for future evaluation. Do not disclose. Project Shiva active. Somewhere in a government office halfway across the world, a red light blinked on a forgotten monitor. A message appeared. Facility breach detected. Human subject contained. And then it blinked out. No one ever heard from John again. But the mountain remembers.